going to go to Senator Roberts.
Thank you, Chair. Mrs Potter, I feel very ashamed of our country. You have been, as a result of lies, you've had your life altered completely, and what we've given you instead of care is gaslighting. But thank you so much for your courage in being here. And I also want to put on the record my appreciation to Senator Rennick for his previous two questions that Dr Neil answered, and answered so capably. Fine questions and excellent responses. Mr Falachuk, you've come before us at the Terms of Reference inquiry. I want to thank everyone for being here in person. Thank you for your commitment. You said in your opening statement, Mr Falachuk, newly disabled and chronically injured, and there are thousands of them. You also mentioned in the Terms of Reference inquiry that doctors were coerced. So I don't need to put questions to you. I would love to, but I've got some other questions. Dr Knudsen, you mentioned, quote, peer-reviewed paper unaffiliated by trial sponsors Pfizer. Could we get that paper, please?
Yes.
On notice?
Yep.
You also told us that more than 50% of Australians took Pfizer, and I'd like to learn more separately on notice. I'll think of some questions for you with regard to your correspondence with Dr Lawler, because I've read it in your submission and I'm stunned. I want to also acknowledge the courage of your stance. And Dr Neil, pharmacovigilance, if I could just have a one-word answer at the moment, because I want to get on to Dr Madry. Pharmacovigilance is not independent, is it, in this country?
One-word answer. I don't believe it is sufficiently independent, and the access is very difficult for the average doctor.
Thank you. And could you send us the paper that you've published, peer-reviewed paper? Send it to us on notice, please.
Yes.
Thank you. Dr Madry, can you comment on the use of models used for predicting excess mortality, please?
Senator, I just want to thank Mrs Potter for you've moved me, and that's part of the reason we do some of this work. There's been an epidemic of bad modelling during this pandemic, Senator. Stanford Professor John Ioannidis, published a paper about how bad modelling was. When we do modelling, we need to apply a range of models to look at best case and worst case scenarios. Models rely on assumptions. Those assumptions can be wrong. If I could just, I know the time is short, but a quick comment on the models that the government's relying on at the moment for predicting the numbers of excess. That model changed last year and predicted lower numbers. There's a number of fundamental issues with that model. It uses a time series modelling that one wouldn't use in modern analysis, fitting a sine wave, which doesn't actually fit the sort of seasonal trends. There was a strange thing that happened from, the standard years were 2015 to 2019, and then, there was a decision to reach back to 2013, and it turned out 2013 is a low year for mortality, 2019 is a high year. So if you wanted to tip up, the baseline and make the excess less, that's what one would do. And in our submission, we've sort of provided a range of what it should be, because the estimates that are there at the moment are very much at the low end of the estimates, and we need to look at the low end, the high end, and the real result should be somewhere in between. There's another issue about subtracting all COVID deaths from and with. We know the convention shouldn't be to count the deaths that are with someone who dies from cancer, for example, who tests positive with a PCR test. They shouldn't be subtracted. We know influenza was down, and during those years. So should we be subtracting all those deaths? Because clearly some of the COVID deaths were deaths of frail elderly people who sadly would have died anyway. So if we're trying to come to what's the clear non-COVID excess, there's more professional ways to look at that. So all I can say, modelling is has been done poorly. That's well established, and I think independent groups like ours that can talk with what's really happening, have a better understanding, and can try and fit ranges to those models. Especially when it's a high-risk situation where people are dying, getting injured, we need to understand what's the best case and worst case scenarios.
Thank you, Dr Madry. What other data is needed to clarify what could be causing the non-COVID excess? mortality.
Okay, so if we wanted to rule out COVID vaccinations as a possible cause of this excess, these data sets that Senator Pratt was talking about, where there's a linkage between immunisation registers and mortality registers. We understand that such joining of tables has been linking of tables has been done by the Institute of Health and Welfare and the ABS. Basically the data that's needed is the date of death, the date of last vaccination and date of death on an individual record basis, and we can go through that and find, if there's trends that shouldn't be there. They should be independent, but there could be trends that look in there, and if we can get access to that, we can provide some insight.
Do you intend to apply for access to that data?
Yes, we've had discussion. Since we've heard more about this, we do intend to apply for it.
Thank you. You said you did an analysis of mortality in Queensland. What did you find?
Okay, so Senator, as you would be interested, Queensland kept out COVID right up until the end of 2021. So with Queensland, we had a 10-month window where we could look at mortality without the effects of COVID. Any deaths from COVID in Queensland were from cruise ships or out of the state. So we purchased data from the ABS with sort of narrow age ranges. And what became clear was that in the older ranges, which is where we saw in the database of adverse event notifications, a lot of the deaths occurring, ages above 60, we saw the trend of mortality start going up in the second quarter of 2021, and that went up right up until the end of the year. So that was, clearly a warning signal.
Thank you. Senator Canavan has a question.
Follow-up here. Have you looked at Western Australia, which had a similar experience? When I look at the ABS data, again, the deaths seem to start ticking up in sort of late 2021, even before the WA border was open.
Yeah, Western Australia has a few more months because they opened up in March, I understand. Yes. We'd have a full 1 year window with Western Australia. So the reason I picked Queensland was partly financial, because there you have the largest state with the longest time. South Australia and Western Australia would be other ones that would be worth looking at.
Okay, thanks.
Can I have one more question? Okay. Dr. Neil, there are many ways excess mortality can be hidden. Classification of causes of death. Can you answer yes or no to each one, whether or not it's possible to hide a death?
So excess mortality typically just considers all-cause mortality. Then there's a secondary sort of inquiry as to what the sub-causes might be.
So with doctors placed under coercion, we could hide a death due to a COVID injection by classifying it as not due to an injection.
So I guess there's two avenues to highlight a death as a doctor, which might be, which as a doctor you might have the opinion that it's a vaccine death. One would be by registering the death on the pharmacovigilance database, and 75% of the deaths were registered by doctors. The other would be to write a death certificate. I believe that's rarely done in a way which would note a vaccine injury as a cause of death, but it is possible.
Thank you. Dr. Madre, they can be statistically hidden or misclassified, correct?
Correct. Misclassification is one of the biggest problems we have as analysts.
A barrister that I talked to said that you can hide evidence, and the best place to hide it is in plain sight.
That's a very wise statement.
Thank you. Are these things being done?
Is it being hidden? There's certainly strange things happening where, the ICD codes, there's, categorisation going into these vague categorisations from where, it might have been very specific, cardiac, respiratory. There are strange things going on. What we can do is we can detect those things happening. So that's, as you said, from a legal, from a forensic point of view, being able to see those sorts of things is insightful in itself, even though it may make it harder to find the actual result we're looking for. But, that's important.
So keeping on the theme of hiding data, we can also have alternative narratives, such as long COVID instead of vaccine injuries. We can also have the use of labels to denigrate people, shut them up, condition an audience that it could be something else, propaganda to sway people's perceptions. Any of these things time with you, Dr. Neil?
Well, we, as a society, we've been concerned about the culture in medicine that tends towards censoring doctors from speaking about some of the key issues of pandemic management, including the vaccine. We believe that's real. We believe we can document it, and it could well have had an effect on the information that's able to come to light.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.